It was a very tough first year, and I got reasonably good grades on legislation and Chattel's exams, which were in December, but the other 5 exams were in May or June, and I had no idea how well I was going to do in those. I was in a class of about 40 guys, no women. And so we took our exams in June, and they posted the grades on the bulletin board outside the dean's office by letter. That is, you had a designated letter or number that told you where to look for your grade, and your grades were next to it. And it turned out in my first year that I had the second highest academic average in the class. So I was thrilled and, convinced I'd made the right choice when I went to law school. I got a job that summer clerking for a Newark law firm that specialized in bankruptcy law. Name of the firm was Raven and Raven. In those days, a 9-month clerkship was a mandatory precondition of admission to the New Jersey bar. So it was a seller's market for law firms. They could hire young lawyers like me and pay me $15 a week, which is what I got from Raven and Raven. And I worked there that summer. At night, after I finished work, I would go to the Rutgers Law Library, and I was writing an article for the Duke Law Journal. I had, in my second semester first year, submitted an article to the Duke Law Journal, and the Duke Law Journal had a faculty advisor named Mel Shim, who turned out to be a dear friend and was a very influential member of the faculty on my life. And Professor Shim made me redraft that article at least 10 times before he finally considered it acceptable for submission and publication at the Law Review. And so I decided that summer of my first year to try another article, which I did. I wrote an article on an arcane subject called the use tax, which is sort of related to the sales tax. And so most nights that summer, I would leave Raven and Raven at 5:30, 6 o'clock, go over to Rutgers Law School, spend a couple hours there, then take the bus back home. My parents probably had left Irvington by then and moved to a new apartment in Newark on Fabian Place. And of course, my brother by that time was probably, 9 or 10 years old. So I spent that summer with him and with them. But it was a tough summer. The only bright spot of that summer was that I was invited to a wedding that summer in Irvington. A young woman named Judy Schneider, who I had gone to Irvington High School with, was getting married. Actually, Schneider was not her maiden name. That's her married name. I don't remember her maiden name. The guy she married was Jerry Schneider, who was from Patterson. And it was at that wedding that I met my late wife. Annette was there with a couple of her friends. And I remember we were standing in line after the ceremony to greet the bride and groom and began to talk. And I was immediately smitten, except she was engaged to another guy. So in any event, I asked her if she would like to come out with a bunch of my friends after that wedding. We were going to a place in Livingston where they had a jukebox and you could get a cheeseburger and a beer, and they had dancing. She said, yeah, I'll come, but you have to invite my friend Flory. So I did, and we had a very nice time together after the wedding, and I told her how sorry I was that she was engaged, and she said, don't worry. She said, you'll find somebody that will make you happy, and nice meeting you. And so I called the bride a few days later, and I said, look, if Ed Tilchin ever breaks up with this guy, his last name was Harabulenik, I said, you let me know, okay? She said she would. And sure enough, she did. So I guess I got the call the following December, my second year of law school. And Ed and I went out that Christmas holiday, and we had dinner together and discovered that we both played chess. And so we agreed that when I went back to law school, she was at Fairleigh Dickinson at the time, or maybe not, maybe she had by then graduated Fairleigh Dickinson and was working, but in any event, we decided we would play chess by mail, which you can do. You make a move, put it on a postcard. It takes a long time to play a game of chess by mail. But so I recall distinctly that I had gone to by this time I had been selected to be on the Duke Law Journal. Not an officer yet, but a member of the Duke Law Journal staff. I was only in my second year. Third year, you got to be an officer. And I went to a law journal conference in Atlanta, Georgia, with two friends. One who is still with us, a dear friend named Russ Robinson, who went on to found the largest law firm in Charlotte, and another guy named Duncan McKee. And we were at this law journal conference in Atlanta. We went out to dinner, and they had postcards on the table. I guess it was a place for tourists. So they put postcards there, and I took the postcard and wrote her a postcard and made the first move of a chess game, pawn to king 4, and mailed it. It's a good thing I did. So my second year of law school was highlighted by a lot of academic work, and because of my appointment to be a member of the Law Journal, I spent a lot of time working on law review articles for submission, and it was a very busy, tough year. I didn't get home much. I did get home, and I saw at the spring vacation, my second year, and we went out again. It was not as successful as the first time, but we still had the chess game going on, so it was hard for her to stop communicating with me, even though she may have been inclined to. And by the end of the third year of law school, we still hadn't finished the game. So that was a golden opportunity for me to call again at the end of the semester and see if I could see her again to finish the game, which we did. I made equally good grades my second year, and still ranked second in the class. The guy who was first was Russ Robinson, the guy who I mentioned before, who we're still in close touch and still good friends. And Russell has just had a marvelous career as the senior partner of a firm in Charlotte by the name of Robinson, Bradshaw, and Hinson, firm with about 140 lawyers today. I got a job at the end of the second year in Washington as an assistant to Senator Estes Kefauver, whom you may or may not remember. He ran for vice president with Adlai Stevenson the second time that Stevenson ran against Eisenhower. But in the summer of 1955, Senator Kefauver was engaged in an investigation of the Dixon-Yates power contract. Dixon-Yates were utility operators in Tennessee, and they were interested in generating power to supply the Tennessee Valley, which had been supplied in the past by the Tennessee Valley Authority. Senator Kefauver was not happy with that, and the Dixon-Yates project, which needed financing from Wall Street, was being assisted by a well-known investment banking firm named First Boston, and a vice president of First Boston named Adolph Wenzel, who was instrumental in doing this financing for Dixon-Yates, turned out to have been an advisor to the Budget Bureau, and Senator Kefauver thought that that presented a conflict of interest. And so he launched an investigation of the Dixon-Yates contract based on this alleged conflict of interest, and he didn't have a big budget, so he had one full-time real lawyer, a guy named Arthur John Keefe, a professor at Catholic University Law School, and 4 kids. And I was one of the kids. I was I had just finished my second year, and I was there with 3 other guys. And we worked that whole summer for Senator Kefauver. Russell Baker, the famous reporter for the New York Times, covered the hearings. A lot of the hearings wound up on the front page of the New York Times and the Herald Tribune. And I was commuting that summer between Washington and New Jersey, where Et was. She was working at a day camp, if I remember. We finally finished the chess game, and our relationship was improving. And so that was a very exciting summer for me. The guy from First Boston, Adolph Wenzel, was represented by the prestigious New York law firm of Sullivan and Cromwell, and the partner in charge of representing First Boston and Wenzel was a famous lawyer named Arthur Dean, who had negotiated the peace treaty at the end of the Korean War. And so it was a very heady experience. I mean, I forget what they were paying me, maybe $50 a week by this time. But it was still very exciting. There was television coverage of our hearings. I would be there every day sitting in the row behind Senator Kefauver and the other senators on the committee. And it was just a wonderful experience. I lived in Washington with the 3 other guys who were working with me on the committee. And then every weekend or 2, I would drive home to New Jersey to see it once she came down to Washington. It was just a very exciting time.
What were you doing as part of the research team?
Well, we were providing Senator Kefauver with legal memoranda, with summaries of evidence, with the basis on which he could challenge the validity of the Dixon-Yates contract. It was a contract, I think, with the Budget Bureau, and that's where the conflict of interest arose, because Wenzel, who had consulted with the Budget Bureau, had also been helping Dixon-Yates with their financing. So we did whatever they asked us to do. I don't really remember clearly what we did, but I was probably 20 years old at the time, and it was very exciting stuff for a second-year law student to be in Washington in the middle of a Senate hearing. I'm not sure that I made a great contribution. I have hanging on the wall a little letter of recognition from the council to the committee, acknowledging that we were there, that we showed up every day, and we did. Sometimes a little bleary-eyed, but we were there. And at the end of the summer, President Eisenhower canceled the Dixon-Yates contract. So the effort was successful. At the end of the summer, I was ready to go back to Duke Law School, and Et was leaving New Jersey with her dear friend Sue Bierman and going to Miami, where she had gotten a job as the activities director at the Miami Jewish Community Center. She had done a lot of work with teenagers at summer camps and other group activities, so they hired her because of her experience with Jewish teenage activities. And I, of course, was going back to Duke. And in those days, it was much more common for young people to marry in their early 20s than it is today, when young people don't marry till their mid-30s or late 20s or whatever. So that was on my mind. It was kind of bewildering to me because I didn't have 50 cents extra that I could call my own. But in any event, she went back to Miami, as I said, to take the job. I went to Duke, and we wrote letters to each other on a daily basis because our relationship had cemented during the summer. And I was absolutely flabbergasted when I got the first letter for her, because she had ordered stationery that had at the top imprinted especially for Gary. Of course, I teased her that she had similar stationery for 5 or 6 other guys, but she swore she didn't. And so I was now in my 3rd year, and I had to make a decision about trying to find a job. And we were communicating on a regular basis. By this time, I had been named associate editor of the Duke Law Review. And so I would go up to the Law Review office every night, which was on the 3rd floor of the law school, with my friend Russ Robinson, who, because his grades were better than mine, he was named the editor. I was the associate editor. And we would work together at night till midnight. And then he would go home because he was married, and I would stay and write Ed a letter. And sometime in September of that year, early September, I got a letter from Ed that said, you know, I want to come up and visit you at Duke. And I wrote back, well, that's great, but I'm going to pay for your airfare. And she wrote back and said, that's nuts. I'm working. I have a salary. You can't pay. And I said, well, you can't come unless you let me buy the ticket. And then she sent me a telegram and said, I've bought my ticket and I'm coming. And I had talked to the guys at the law school about her, and they had not seen me with a woman down at Duke because she had never been there before, and our connection was New Jersey. But because they knew about her and knew that she was flying up from Florida, when I went to meet her at the airport, half the law school followed me, and so she was greeted by about 20 guys from my law school class when she got off the plane, which made a big impression. And during that weekend, which was September 1955, I proposed to at the Duke football stadium, but I asked her to promise not to tell anybody because I was scared and I didn't have any money and I didn't want anybody to know. And she said, what, are you out of your mind? I'm going to tell everybody, including your parents. And so we were engaged as of September 24, 1955. Of course, I didn't have money for a ring, but it was very exciting. My parents were perhaps a little less excited since they were wondering whether I was going to be able to get a job after law school. When we went home Christmas time to meet with my parents and talk to them about the wedding, my father had the temerity to say to Et, you know, maybe you and Gary should go a little slower and delay the wedding. And Ed turned to him and said, Morris, we're not asking you when we should get married. We're telling you. We're getting married in June. And that was the last time he took her on. So, strangely enough, I was unsophisticated about job applications. I knew Duke had a placement office, and I knew some law firms would be coming down, but I didn't contact any firms in New York or New Jersey in the fall or winter of 1956. And
before we talk about applying for the jobs, I wanted to ask what did you kind of see for yourself in the law at that point? What did your classes really focused on or specialized in?
Well, it isn't that you specialize. Your law school education is a generalist education. But at that time, I wanted a job. I mean, if I had been more sophisticated, I would have applied for a judicial clerkship because my grades were good. And I didn't know a lot about, I didn't know that, for example, that the justices on the New Jersey Supreme Court hired law clerks. Nobody told me. Mm-hmm. Or that the federal judges hired law clerks. I mean, I may have known it generically, but Professor Maggs put me in touch with a Washington, D.C. law firm, and I went up and interviewed there, a firm called Arnold, Fortas, and Porter. The Fortas was the famous Washington lawyer who became a justice of the Supreme Court. But I didn't apply to any of the New York firms until the spring of my last year of law school. And as luck would have it, a guy I knew who had graduated Duke Law School 2 years before me, named Bill Kalin, had gotten a job at a medium-sized New York law firm by the name of Kramer, Marx, Greenlee, and Backus. It was an offshoot of the famous New York law firm White and Case. And Bill must have dropped me a note or called or something, but he suggested that when I came home for spring vacation, that I stop in at the firm and talk to them about the possibility of working there. I didn't have any other irons in the fire. Again, if I had been diligent and done my homework, I would have sent out 25 letters in the fall and tried to get interviews with a bunch of firms because my record was good enough. But I didn't. And so when I went up for spring break in 1956, I went to the Kramer Marx law firm. I had an appointment and I met with the senior partners, Henry Marx and Richard Greenlee, and they offered me a job starting at $4,000 a year, the summer of 1956. And I said yes. I mean, it was a firm at the time that probably had 20 to 25 lawyers. They had a litigation practice, a tax practice, a very good corporate practice. And they were very sophisticated lawyers. They had, as I said, the firm was an outgrowth of White and Case, and they had some very big clients. They represented General Dynamics. They represented a major construction company called the George Fuller Construction Company. And $4,000 a year was a little less than what was the going rate in 1956. The going rate, so to speak, was $4,500 a year. But they said you get a generous bonus, so they offered me a job, $4,000 a year, and I took it. And then I went back to law school, graduated in June. I went down to Florida to pick up at. By that time, I actually had my father's old 1948 Ford in my third year of law school. First time I had a car. So I drove down to Florida, brought her up to Durham for graduation. My parents and my grandmother on my mother's side came down for the graduation. My brother was there. Graduated law school, went up to New Jersey, took the New York bar exam that June. I think I took the exam on the 29th and 30th of June, and we got married on June 1st. On July 1st, 1956. And the whole wedding cost about $25. We got married in a rabbi's study. We had a little garden party in the backyard of Et's sister's house in Paramus, where refreshments consisted of a scooped out watermelon with fruit, some baked chocolate chip cookies, and the big expensive items, printed matches and printed napkins. Et smoked cigarettes in those days, unfortunately. And after the wedding, we went off for a 1-week honeymoon in the Berkshires. I didn't know this at the time, but my parents were so embarrassed at the tiny wedding that we had that they took their whole family out to dinner. That is, my father's and mother's brothers and sisters, but they didn't invite Et and me, so we didn't hear about it till we got back. We had gotten an apartment in the meantime in Brooklyn Heights at 132 Gerolman Street, and got back from the Berkshires probably Saturday, July 7th. Sunday, July 8th, went to Sears and Roebuck and bought 2 dressers and a record cabinet, which I stained that day. And I had stain inside my fingernails, which we got off with turpentine, and started work on Monday, July 9th, 1956, at Kramer, Marx, Greenlee, and Backus. That was kind of a red letter day in my legal career.
You want to take a break?
No, I'm good.
Okay.
Yep.
I just want to ask 1 or 2 more questions about Duke. You had mentioned in an interview that's actually going to be linked to this one, your interview with Eagleton on the governor's administration, that you were in law school at the time of the Brown v. Board of Education Act decision.
Yep.
Can you kind of describe what the reaction was to that?
Sure. There were a lot of Southern guys in the class, and some reacted very badly. Some thought it was dead wrong, thought it was intrusive, thought the Supreme Court had no business interfering with the South's long-standing practice of having separate schools. Their argument was that there was nothing wrong with that it was not unconstitutional, that the black schools were equal. Of course they weren't. All you had to do was drive by one of the black schools in Durham, and you would get a clear picture of the terrible inequality. The schools looked run down. The outside athletic facilities were mediocre, crumbling, and the reaction of my Southern colleagues, not all of them, but just some of them, was that this is our way of life and we have a right to have our schools separate. I thought it was a historic moment for the country, and I'm not sure that I appreciated the long-term implications as much as I should have, because it wasn't as if segregation stopped cold. The court said in Brown 1 that separate but equal schools are unconstitutional. A year later in Brown 2, they said the South has to desegregate with all deliberate speed, but nothing happened when I was in law school. And as a matter of fact, nothing happened for a good 10 years after that, because the southern school districts resisted, as you might imagine. And instead of complying and integrating their schools, many southern school districts adopted what they called school choice plans, under which they maintained the white and black schools, but they gave to the children the choice of which school to attend. Mm-hmm. Obviously, the white kids chose to attend the white schools, but many of the black children and parents were afraid, were intimidated to choose to attend the white schools. So you got some movement, but not enough to make a difference. And it didn't, the desegregation movement really didn't take root until the United States Supreme Court decided Green against Kent County in 1965, where they said, this school choice system doesn't work. You're putting the burden on the children and families that have been discriminated against to take the initiative to stop the discrimination. That's not fair. Mm-hmm. You have to stop separate schools and stop segregation, root and branch, in every aspect of your school systems. And when the Supreme Court decided the Green case, the southern states began to comply because President Johnson, to his credit, used the provision of the Civil Rights Act to threaten to withhold funding from southern states that didn't implement desegregation as the Supreme Court had ordered. So while Brown against Board of Education was historic, I left Duke in 1956, and I think that my consciousness, while it had been raised during my time there, my focus shifted. I shifted my attention to learning the skills of my trade. I was now a lawyer being paid to practice law, to advise clients, to write documents, to do research. I wanted to be very good at it, and so I focused my attention in that direction and put to one side the inspiration that I had felt when the Supreme Court decided Brown.
Were there any reactions to the way the case was presented, the use of social science evidence, that sort of thing?
I don't remember that,
okay.
Sean. I don't remember. Certainly we read it, we discussed it in class, we talked about it, but I don't remember any specific reaction except for the reaction of a couple of guys from the South who thought it was outrageous.
While you were in Durham, do you think you faced any anti-Semitism?
Well, except for the experience in applying, I would say no, although Duke had a typical fraternity system at the time, and on campus there were 2 fraternities for members of the Jewish faith. It struck me at the time as odd, but I was invited to join one of the 2 fraternities, and I did, and I was a member for about a year and a half. Lived in that fraternity's dormitory. In fact, when I had the laundry route, that was where I got my customers from. But as soon as I left the undergraduate school for the law school in 1954, I kind of separated myself from the fraternity. But I would say there was not any conscious anti-Semitism. Some of my friends and I would often travel about an hour to a college in Greensboro that had a larger number of Jewish women undergraduates than Duke had. Duke, because of its quota system, did not have an abundance of Jewish undergraduates, and so the odds were a little bit difficult at Duke. And so to improve the odds, we would often go on a weekend over to Women's College in Greensboro, where there were more women of the Jewish faith, and I did date over there. But I would say there was no significant anti-Semitic experience at Duke while I was there. It was, it was a Methodist school, mm-hmm. and it was very clearly identified as a Methodist school. Church attendance was not mandatory, but it was certainly a very important part of college life. As I said, you had to take a course in religion, a full year course. And the chapel was the dominant building on the campus. It was impossible to miss. It sat right in the center of Campus Drive. So I would say the school at that time had somewhat of a religious Methodist dominance, but it didn't affect me or bother me significantly. And it wasn't until years later that I fully appreciated the significance of my admission experience in the undergraduate school, that I fully realized what it was that made it so hard for them to accept me, and how it was that Charlie Max finally got me to be accepted. I obviously didn't appreciate it at the time. I do today.